Let's talk about a research-based idea called the Matthew effect. This concept is based on a large body of research, and I think that when we unpack this idea, it can really help us understand the challenges that we see with all students as they move through our care, K-12. And to do that, we're going to watch a brief video produced by the Washington Core Advocates to explain this idea.
The Matthew effect is a research-based concept that analyzes the differences between proficient and non-proficient readers. School systems know that for a variety of reasons, some kids come to us with more words. They've seen more words, heard more words, interacted with more texts than other kids. And that's a great thing, unless you're one of the kids who hasn't had that much interaction with words and text. We now realize that the more words you know, the easier it is to learn more words, and words unlock knowledge. You see, the thing is, as early as 3rd grade, we start to see differences between these two groups of kids. We'll call them proficient readers and non-proficient readers. What researchers have uncovered is that proficient readers start at a higher point than non-proficient readers, and that proficient readers grow at a faster rate than non-proficient readers. So what starts out as a small gap in words and knowledge in early grades turns into a huge gap in later grades. In fact, the longer students are in school, the greater the difference between children who are reading proficiently and those who are not reading proficiently. So what can we do about this? One thing we can do is to help our non-proficient readers gain more vocabulary. And one of the best ways to achieve that is by reading or listening to a series of texts on the same topic. One study found this approach could yield as much as 4 times the vocabulary growth as other approaches.
We love it so much, we just want to watch it again.
Show it another time.
So wanted to give you a moment to really just pause and reflect a bit about what you heard. There's a visual on the screen to sort of remind you about some of the big ideas you heard about what the Matthew effect is all about. And there's 2 questions to either stop and reflect on, to do a stop and jot or to discuss with your colleagues.
So what do you guys think? I mean, we talk about the Matthew effect all the time. I actually feel like it's one of those things that you know intuitively as an educator, but when you are confronted with the idea that there's research behind this, it really just makes you pause and think about what that means for our students, that gap grows every year they're in school. That gap grows more and more.
Well, one of the things is that if you look at the graph, there's not that much of a difference in the beginning. So the first thing that comes to mind is you want to stop it while it's small.
Yeah.
And because it's a great deal easier to stop it while it's small than it is to stop it as it expands over the years.
Right.
And I know Stanovich, one of the researchers that where this comes from, he talks about the idea that when children are small, they're learning to crack the code of reading, and students who do crack the code early then benefit from kind of those advantages of the good reader track, right? So they're able to read more, and because they can read more, they're learning more words, and they're exposed to more complicated ideas and more knowledge as they go. So not disconnected from the idea of learning to read, but the benefits actually then continue when you're kind of just a good reader.
Right, and Stanovich, as I've mentioned in other presentations, those students who are not expanding are essentially in a different environment than those students who are. Their language is different. What they enjoy doing is different. Because if you're struggling with reading, you don't enjoy it.
Right, right.
Oh, I wanted to just go back to one of the brief mention of a study about how we can use reading on a topic to grow our vocabulary in important ways. And it's the video mentioned that when we read on a topic that we can grow our vocabulary up to 4 times as fast, which is sort of an astounding, if we think about those 2 lines that are widening, if we think about growing vocabulary at 4 times the rate, that's sort of an astounding fact in the way that we could make sure that gap is narrowing and not increasing.
Yeah, that connects to kind of the visual we had here. We're thinking about how can we solve this in schools? How can we keep wanting to go like this, close the gap? How can we actually support our students so that gap doesn't exist and grow over time? And topic-based studies can really help with that, and exposing all students to the complicated academic vocabulary and ideas found in rich texts. That's the work of schools. we are going to talk about the ingredients of knowledge building instruction. So what do we need in place in order to have classrooms that are really knowledge building? So to illustrate this, just want you to take a second and read the paragraph on your screen, thinking about the author's purpose. Why was this paragraph written? You guys have a good answer?
Absolutely not.
All right, well, let me help you. How about now? There are 3 different reasons that authors write something, sometimes to persuade, sometimes to inform, and sometimes to entertain. Does that help you with this task?
Well, not unless we added a 4th line of sometimes to confuse.
I don't think that was the purpose. But what if we did that for a week? What if every day we had different stories that we read and we categorized them based on whether they informed, they persuaded, or they entertained us? Would that help you?
I'm afraid not.
And that is our point, right? Just going through these kind of discrete skills or strategies doesn't necessarily help us with the richness of this text.
Yeah.
So you can assume that unless you are really familiar with German philosophy or existentialism, you may not be able to understand what's here. If you haven't worked on analyzing the concept of being,
Yeah.
you're not likely to get any closer to the author's purpose here. You want to take a second and just kind of chat, pause the webinar and chat about what that means for traditional reading instruction. We are going to talk about what we can do instead of what we just showed on the screen. So we're going to talk about the ingredients of knowledge building classrooms. And we've got 4 different ingredients here on the screen that we're going to go through.
Great. And that first one is about knowledge and vocabulary growth as being a purpose for why we are actually doing what we're doing in classrooms. So one of the purposes for instruction. So thinking about traditional literacy instruction and a text like Bridge to Terabithia, classic in our elementary schools, and how we may have in the past thought about how, as an example that we just went through, this week we're going to describe characters with this text, and that's what we're going to be working on, and it's really going to be our focus for instruction, and whether that matches what we know about how proficient readers actually read. And the answer is that actually good readers are drawing on, yes, maybe describing characters with that text, but they're also doing a whole lot of other things to comprehend. They're using skills and strategies as they're reading. And that's really goes into this idea called standard coherence. David, do you want to talk to us about that?
Sure. The standard coherence comes from a body of work by a Danish cognitive scientist that addressed the question of what characterizes the absolute best readers. Mm-hmm. And another way to look at it is you have students who are equally proficient in vocabulary, equally proficient, they're fluent readers, they're proficient in vocabulary, and they're pretty much the same and proficient background knowledge. Are they all the same, or are some of them better than others? And what they came up with is that the most proficient readers, number one, expect to understand everything that a text has to offer, all of it. And number two, closely related to number one, they work to get it. And those are the two characteristics of the absolute best readers. And I often use it as an explanation of the research behind close reading. If we don't expose students to rich, complex text, and we only give them text that they can pretty much understand on their own, then where does the standard of coherence ever develop?
So with the Bridge to Terabithia example, it's not that you are saying we're doing character traits because it's character month, but you're actually deeply processing what makes the character Jessie an important, rich character in the book because it helps you to understand the text. You're actually doing that because it matters to the text itself, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's really the intention of the reading standards. They are broken into categories. There's reading, and there's writing, and there's language. Those standards go together to help readers understand a text. So they are integrated, and they should be applied holistically with the text itself really pointing out what distinct standard might need to be targeted for a question or a task because of what the text calls for.
Yep. Text first.
Text first. Yeah.
And I think the traditional literacy, the instruction can oversimplify sort of why we're seeing students do what they do. So there's an example on the screen of a multiple choice question about Derek and the narrator, and it's asking how does what happened affect what happens next, and there's some options there. And this question is sort of most obviously connected to Reading Standard 3. The third grade standard is on the screen here about describing characters and explaining how their actions contribute to something else that happens in the story. So if a student answers this question in a particular way, it might be that they actually didn't understand how a character in a story contributed to that next thing that happened. But it could also be a whole lot of other things, and there's a big list on that right side of the screen that could have impacted how that student responded to the question. So it could be that there was some essential vocabulary in that passage they didn't understand, and that prevented them from making that connection. It could be that there was really dense information in that part of the story. Often it can be that students were not fluent enough to understand and be grasping what was happening in the story. Their stamina, knowledge demands, of course. We've been talking a lot about that in this course, but there's lots of things that it could be besides just isolating that one skill or standard.
Right. So I think, David, you mentioned your former colleague who calls this kind of traditional simplification a smooth road.
Right.
But it's a smooth road in the wrong direction. It's easier, but it doesn't necessarily get at the root causes. So when we're looking at knowledge in particular as one of those causes, we have to spend time building students' knowledge up. It takes time, and we're not giving it. In fact, the more we see students struggle with reading, the more likely schools and districts are to cut things like social studies and science. So teachers report spending far less time each day on science and social studies rather than reading and math. And so really thinking about that role of knowledge being diminished unless we're repurposing reading instruction to have a knowledge building role.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize that well, two things. That doesn't minimize understanding elements of literature or understanding an author's purpose or anything else like that. And also, the first book, my parents didn't read to me at all, never, and weren't particularly educated. My mother was intelligent, but not terribly educated. The first time I read a full-length work was when my fifth grade class in New York, in Brooklyn, New York, 200 or 300 years ago, they would go to a room that they made into a library, and you had to pick a book, either do that or stay there and watch the paint peel on the walls. So I pulled out a book called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which was about the first air raid on Tokyo right after the beginning of World War II, right after Pearl Harbor. And the pilots, they knew those pilots couldn't come back. Planes couldn't go that far back to the States or anything near it. They had to land in China. Most of the book was actually all about China at that time in the war, at that time in history, what it was like, how people made a living, and how they dealt with the American flyers. It was a whole wealth of knowledge that came out of a full-length work. And at some point in our work with the standards and my work with Student Achievement Partners, it occurred to me that a student could go through K through 12th grade without ever reading a full-length nonfiction text. I think we've changed that with the standards, but that was a stunning insight to me. And it doesn't mean that these texts can't be analyzed the way they traditionally have, of all the things that Terry and Tori have said, because it's not mutually exclusive.
Right.
In fact, it's mutually reinforcing.
Right. Absolutely.
So I think we're saying that it's not just predictions week, but that we can use everything we know about the skills and strategies readers use to have a good standard of coherence so they can understand the whole text, but that we can also think about how we can have building knowledge and vocabulary be part of what we're trying to get out of reading a literary or a nonfiction text as part of our instruction.
Yeah.
So how do we do it?
How do we do it? I'm glad you asked, Tori. So once we have this idea that knowledge and vocabulary is a purpose, it's part of the purpose for instruction, we also can have multiple texts and resources on the topic. David talked about a full-length nonfiction text. That's one idea. Multiple resources on the same topic is another. So devoting a substantial amount of resources to knowledge building. Just taking a second as we're thinking about the idea of topics versus themes, I'd actually like to ask you out there to pause once more and think about the difference between a topic and theme. And we've got some examples on the screen just to guide your thinking. But what's the difference between the list on the left under topics and the list on the right under themes? And what impact do you think using topics or themes might have on student learning? So hopefully you got a chance to discuss that. We have really summarized this as topics are conceptually coherent. They connect to one another. They connect, like sea mammals is a coherent topic. Whereas themes are much more abstract. Arguably, you have to understand the topic of a text first in order to connect it to another text on the same theme, right? It's a lot more abstract. And it takes more work to unpack and would be something that really happens after you're understanding the topic itself. So
I was just thinking about, if you think about texts that could be organized under some of those themes and how wildly different they could be. For example, family. So you could have texts about families in very different situations and different settings, and that the ideas, the concepts that you're going to learn through reading those texts will be much less coherent than a series of texts or resources, or even a full-length work on any of the things that are on the left. And that the knowledge that you would build would be much less coherent, right? If you're using something like themes.
Whereas topics, if you're reading about children in Vietnam and you're getting a chance to see what schooling is like and what family life is like, you can actually take the knowledge that you're getting from one text and apply it to the next text to better understand it. So that knowledge is a form of a scaffold there.
Right.
Now, the only thing I would add, and I'm thinking more of the elementary level, but maybe that's not right. But the basals that we used for instruction for most of all of our lifetimes, even mine, were organized around themes.
Absolutely.
And so let's say the child goes home and the parents ask, well, what did you talk about? What did you learn about today? What did you read about today? You're not going to get the same kind of excitement with decisions or friendship or courage as you are with dragonflies or vampires. Well, you have vampires in elementary school as a rule, but airplanes or explorers or sea mammals, because it resonates with children more and they can hold it more than something as abstract as a theme. And they're just far more likely to get excited about that than they are an abstract theme. I've always questioned how much those abstract themes really stick in the ribs of children as they move through the grades.
It's the did you know statements around the dinner table, right? If you're learning about influenza, it's really likely that your 9 or 12 or 6-year-old student is going to say, did you know? Right, exactly. Did you know this happens? Did you know? Which is much less likely if you're learning of stories of friendship across the board, right? Yeah. I think it's important that you brought up, especially since in this recorded webinar style, we can't hear people's dialogue out there. Teachers and educators tend to really like the themes because there's a lot of fun connections you can make and it feels rich. And I think that's at an adult level. But I would say in middle school and in elementary school, probably in high school too, learning concrete topics, like learning facts, that's really highly engaging for kids and leads to those did you know statements.
I think it's overwhelmingly true for elementary school. I'm not sure I would agree about high school. I think at that point, you do try to make the big picture and make those connections. And middle school, like always, is in the middle.
It's good this is a K-8 class.
Yeah. And I also think it's interesting about how you could apply some of that abstract thematic thinking to topics.
Right.
Just looking across to the left-hand side, there's lots of things that you could have great conversations about survival while talking about sea mammals, dragonflies. And so those connections can still be made, I think, in terms of big picture thinking.
So we're thinking about what this looks like in a lesson, over the course of a unit, over the course of a year, and multiple years. So we have a couple of examples for you just to see what this looks like when instructional materials are doing this well. This first example, you can pause if you want to chat through what you're seeing on the screen if you want to look at it a little bit more closely.
And I highly recommend you do that.
So please do.
But we see this now. This is an example of the course of a year, which includes modules that are intentionally knowledge building. You can see that based on the module title itself.
Yep.
And then you can see how the text underneath that module 2 is about biodiversity in the rainforest. And you've got a range of texts that really contribute, both fiction and nonfiction. I see the Great Kapok Tree is a great fiction example of this, right? That really builds students' knowledge about that biodiversity in the rainforest. Another example here, this comes, actually I should mention because we try to highlight open source curriculum. This one comes from EL Education, which is an open source curriculum that's available online. Yeah. This one comes from CoreKnowledge Language Arts, and they trace the path from units that build knowledge across multiple years. So they actually have connections from the knowledge from kindergarten to first grade to second grade around their history units that are their reading units that are focused on history as their topic.
Yeah.
And then we also know that some of you out there have non-examples, maybe from the curriculum you're putting together or from the curriculum you've been given in your school. And we will talk more in a future module about what to do if you have a non-example, but you actually are going to look for opportunities to build knowledge. So you're thinking about that puzzle that we're building for our students. We're thinking about putting together those knowledge building puzzle pieces. So you're gonna look for texts and resources that you can add on to a less rich curriculum. Here you can see that the topics are thematic and that the texts sort of change from week to week.
Yeah.
So week 1 is friendship, week 2 is the community, week 3 is liberty and justice. Not a lot of time to build knowledge there.
Yeah.
So you might want to take this this liberty and justice week and blow that up, add resources on that can really connect to building knowledge, right? Putting that puzzle together.
Yeah. So we've talked about sort of how knowledge and vocabulary can be a purpose for your instruction, what resources you're selecting and how you're using them. Talked about how you can use multiple texts or resources on a conceptually related topic. Now we're going to dig into a little bit how we can use attention to rich academic vocabulary in support of building knowledge and vocabulary. So this comes from a research study. And David, did you want to talk through this at all?
This was a study done in the 1980s, I think, or early 90s. And
1997.
1997. I'm a little bit off.
Good on you.
That showed that when you're involved, when anybody is reading a series of texts over a topic, series of text within a topic, there's a huge increase in how much academic vocabulary or tier 2 vocabulary is grown in that time period.
Right. And the topic in that study was students were reading about.
So that was actually a simulation, the Landauer and
Right,
Deny,
yes.
but there was a Cervetti study in
Right,
2016 where students were reading about birds.
Right.
They were reading connected texts about birds in one group
Right,
and
yep.
disconnected texts in the other. And the students who read about birds outperformed students who read disconnected texts on a vocabulary and comprehension assessment that compared the two. So they learned more tier 2 vocabulary through reading about connected topic.
And just to go back to that for a second, it's an elegant study because what they did was they implanted in the text the same 10 tier 2 words, and then they tested how did the children who read the series of conceptually coherent texts on birds do better on those same 10 words than the children in the text that jumped around from topic to topic, but also had the same tier 2 words, and they did by a statistically significant margin. We should also be clear to explain what conceptually coherent is, because it's not an intuitive concept. The idea was that in the series of texts on birds, there was a text 1 introduced the birds, or what a bird is compared to other animals. And then the next text was, so text 1 was general, and the next text might have been on the role of the wings and the structure and function of the wings, and the third text on habitat, where birds live and how they create their nests, and then the next one on reproduction. So that's conceptually coherent.
I'm picturing that puzzle, like each of those texts was filling in a piece of that jigsaw puzzle to round out your knowledge of birds, right?
As opposed to something like one text on eagles and then the next text on hummingbirds, and they're covering everything in each one. The knowledge doesn't cohere, and if it's less coherent, it's less likely to stick.
Great.
So we know that vocabulary grows with knowledge, and that it can grow exponentially when we are reading multiple things on the same topic. And this visual really is just showcases that when we're reading about a topic like transportation, that the words that we learn are also conceptually connected. So we might be reading things about water, air, and land, and that all of those words are growing and connected together, and that's how our brain is sort of absorbing the new knowledge and vocabulary that we're learning, and that there's huge benefits for all students when we read on a conceptually coherent topic.
And the last ingredient we have for you today is an opportunity for students to really showcase their learning. So if they're doing all these things, they're learning a lot. We just made a case for the knowledge and the vocabulary that they are developing through these types of units of study. And we want to think about how students can showcase that. So they can do this through really lightweight opportunities, and we'll give a few examples, or more structured opportunities, but they're getting a chance to connect their reading and their writing and their speaking and listening and show off the knowledge and vocabulary gained. So some examples here are just an opportunity for students to write. So write what you've learned, or potentially on the right-hand side, we've got writing, drawing, or listing kind of questions and the important learning about the topic that you get from each source, whether it's a new text, whether it's multimedia resources. So they get a journal that showcases the knowledge that they've gained over time.
Yeah. And very lightweight option, right? So both of those examples were things you could use again and again once it becomes a system and routine in your classroom, which is pretty cool.
Absolutely. Another option here is the idea of something we call a rolling vocabulary journal, where each time students are reading a connected text, they're actually taking note of a number of words that are critical or key words to the text that they're reading. So that teachers like to do this sometimes. They'll say, you know, your sensational 6 or your fabulous 5 words, but words that are most important to what they're learning. Potentially writing the words and also writing sentences that show how those words are used in context from the text or in context from the student's own application, and getting to do that over time with each text, and then potentially for the whole unit, can you come up with your fabulous 5 from this whole unit on animal adaptations that summarize what you've learned? Again, we say this is lightweight because you can train your kids to do this as a routine. It works well at all grade levels with more picture opportunities for younger kids potentially, maybe more expectations for the sentence writers for sentence writing for older students. But you can actually walk around the room and kind of easily monitor that your students are gaining that vocabulary and knowledge from the study of those resources this way.
Great. Here's a little bit more structured of an opportunity for students to do some writing. This comes from a 2nd grade core knowledge language arts unit.
We used it in an earlier module if people have been following us all the way through.
On early Asian civilizations. And you'll see that the helpful vocabulary box is intended to highlight some of those tier 2, that academic language, or tier 3, the domain specific language that we might want to see students using. It's there to remind them that they could be using these words in their writing. And then the writing task itself is asking for students to use evidence from all the things that they've learned from all the resources, and that could be text, that could also be visuals or videos as well, but using that vocabulary to showcase what they've learned across those resources and really give you a great gauge of what kind of knowledge and vocabulary kids have learned and picked up.
What I love about this kind of task, it can work really well if you need some sort of pre and post assessment. Just imagine I ask you right now to write about using 4 of those vocabulary words to describe how water was important to early Asian civilization. I personally would need to do some knowledge building first to be able to write a good response. And so you really know that what you're seeing is the student's best writing, but you're also seeing what they've learned from your reading. So such a
absolutely.
really clear picture.
Yeah, so both and. Here's some other sort of knowledge showcasing opportunities. Some of these are quite creative and fun. This is for the same unit of study on ancient Asian civilization. So the first one is having students create, act out, plan and act out a story that has to do with some of the content that they had been learning. So could have some drama, great drama happening, students to get all of that speaking, listening, and writing get down. The left-hand example is sort of putting students in a you were there situation where they have to showcase their knowledge through pretending that they were, for example, at the Great Wall of China. So you could, I'm sure, have some fabulous responses of students pretending that they were right there in the event. And then the right-hand side is asking students to do an art project that has to do with some of the content that they've learned. So a lot of examples for how you could do lightweight things that just become routines in your classroom, all the way up through designing a sort of project-based experience that students could work in groups to showcase all that they've learned. So just the idea is that kids are reading, writing, talking, and listening to other kids talk about the knowledge and vocabulary they've gained.
Two things. You Were There actually was a TV show in the past, probably before either of you were born.
Also a book series, I believe.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
It is. They're great.
I think that of all these, probably the single most potent mechanism to bring knowledge back in is to become aware of it in everything we do with children.
Yeah.
And I've seen in some of these, because we do now have, in addition to core knowledge, we have a number of programs now, of core ELA programs that are based on knowledge.
Yeah.
Are content rich, and teachers have trouble not bringing back more strategies or more skills. And it's like it's a reversal that they're reading these texts. They're used to reading these texts to learn these skills. And so even though they're reading and they're working with children on a text that everybody's interested in, it's hard for them not to stop bringing back skills and strategies.
Yeah.
It's really a paradigm shift. And probably more than anything, once that paradigm shift begins to settle into our teaching, that will be stronger than probably anything else.
And to pull it back to the standard of coherence work that we started with here, you are still doing that kind of metacognitive thinking, but you're doing it about a topic. So it's not cause and effect week anymore, but you're studying the Silk Road, and boy, are you identifying the effect that the production of silk had on trade, and how that Silk Road showed that effect, right? By the impact that it had on trade.
Yes.
So you're doing it with a purpose that will feel much richer to hopefully to kids and teachers as they're thinking about this work. So, absolutely. And these are absolutely the ingredients of knowledge building classrooms, and are really an exciting opportunity for you to think about enriching your students' lives as well. So another homework assignment for you as you're digesting the content of Module 2, we have two options again for you to choose from. The first one is for classroom teachers. You're thinking about your own instructional materials and your own program, and we want you to determine whether you already have these knowledge building ingredients in your instructional materials or your program. That might be the curriculum, the published curriculum you use. It might be the supporting resources that your school or district uses. But do you already have those ingredients, or do you need to make adjustments? And really reflect on how you can incorporate knowledge building into your classroom or enhance what you're already doing.
Great. And option B this time is thinking about writing a letter, email, or creating a presentation to a colleague, and really reflecting on this question that sort of ties together some of the pieces that we went through in this module. How can we use building knowledge to change the impact of the Matthew effect on our students? And of course, we'd encourage you to share that with us again if you'd be willing, or to really send that letter, email, or presentation off to a colleague to sort of get the conversation moving about why knowledge building is important.
So you can tweet at Achieve the Core, you can hashtag Core Advocates, take some time to share with us on social media, and we're excited for what you come up with here.